Imagine, for a moment, that you are a peaceful toad living your best toad life. You sit on lily pads. You blink one eye at a time. You occasionally regret nothing because you are a toad. And existential crises require a more complicated brain. And then, one day, while minding your business and contemplating the meaning of moistness, you suddenly explode. Not emotionally, not metaphorically, not in the sense of wow, Gerald really blew up at the meeting today. No, you literally detonate like a tiny amphibian grenade. Welcome, my sleepy dreamers, to one of the strangest scientific mysteries in modern history. A story so bizarre that even the people studying it said, "Surely this cannot be happening," while standing knee-deep in what once was a perfectly normal toad. Tonight on Sleepy Dreamer in America, we drift softly into the tale of how a quiet German pond in 2005 became the setting for an amphibian horror film nobody asked for. A place where toads swelled up to enormous sizes, ballooned like they were preparing for a birthday party, and then abruptly burst with a wet pop that left biologists staring into the distance, rethinking every career choice that led them to this exact moment. This is the story of exploding toads, and it begins exactly how you'd expect, with scientists squinting at a pond and saying, "Well, that's not ideal." In the early spring of that year, reports started surfacing from Hamburg. People strolling past ponds noticed something alarming. Toads were swelling like overinflated beach balls, stumbling around like they had wildly overestimated their alcohol tolerance, and then bursting dramatically, leaving behind nothing but legs, confusion, and a faint sense that nature might be filing a complaint against itself. At first, authorities assumed the public was exaggerating. After all, humans are known to embellish nature. "I saw a fish the size of a car" usually means "I saw a fish." But soon, eyewitnesses multiplied. Park rangers confirmed, veterinarians confirmed, the toads themselves, in their final moments, confirmed in the most explosive way imaginable. Scientists arrived on the scene expecting a simple explanation: pollution, disease. Prankster teenagers with too much curiosity and too many firecrackers. Instead, they found something far stranger. The toads were inflating from within, distending like fleshy balloons, their skins stretching to translucent limits before pop. Some explosions were so forceful that pieces of toad landed several feet away. This is not ideal behavior for a toad. This is not ideal behavior for anything. As the news spread, Germany began quietly panicking. Reporters dubbed it the Toad Apocalypse, which, while dramatic, was accurate enough that no one protested. The ponds were cordoned off. Local children were told not to look at the water. Adults were told not to look either, mostly because it was gross. And the scientists leaned in. There is a special look a biologist gets when nature throws an unexpected curveball, a mixture of horror, fascination. And I have waited my entire life for something this weird. And the exploding toads brought that look out in full force. At first, the experts searched for toxins, then bacteria, then fungi, then parasites, then malicious forces, then supernatural causes, then, presumably, prankster ghosts. But the answer when it finally emerged, was so strange, so darkly comedic, and so deeply tragic that even seasoned researchers admitted they weren't sure whether to publish a paper or simply go lie down. Tonight, we walk through that mystery gently. We will follow the scientists as they poke, investigate, theorize, argue, and occasionally question reality. We will discover how an innocent species became the center of a natural crime scene. We will learn what, or who, was actually responsible for the toad explosions. And by the end, you will understand why this bizarre event remains one of the most unintentionally hilarious scientific mysteries of the 21st century. So settle in. Close your eyes. Let your brain grow soft like a placid pond at twilight. This is the story of how scientists, quite accidentally, helped the world discover that toads could explode. When the first team of scientists arrived at the now infamous Hamburg pond, they approached the scene with the cautious optimism of people who really hoped this problem could be solved with a clipboard and a polite conversation with nature. But nature had already packed its bags, turned off the lights, and whispered, "Good luck, losers." Imagine a group of biologists kneeling beside a pond that looked tranquil, calm, peaceful, except for the quiet presence of amphibian debris scattered like confetti left over from a birthday party thrown by frogs who did not understand their own strength. The scientists stared. The remaining toads stared back. Everyone was deeply uncomfortable. The first question, naturally, was this: why were the toads swelling up like biological balloons? One researcher knelt beside a still-living specimen, observing with the solemnity of someone watching a marshmallow expand to rapidly in a microwave. The toad puffed up, inflating to several times its normal size, its skin stretched taut, like dough rising under supernatural influence. It made one final, resigned croak that could only be translated as, "This seems bad," and then, pop. The scientists flinched. One took frantic notes. Another quietly whispered, "Neen," very softly. A third simply set down his notebook and wondered whether dentistry might have been a more peaceful career. Something was causing these amphibians to inflate violently until they ruptured like overfilled water balloons with personal grievances. But what? Toxicity? Parasites? Radiation? Angry fairies? Hamburg had many possibilities. The team collected samples, water samples, tissue samples, bits of toad samples that no one had emotionally prepared for in graduate school. They ran tests. They made charts. They squinted at microscopes with the intensity of people trying to solve a crossword puzzle where all the clues simply say why. The first hypothesis was pollution. After all, modern humans rarely meet a pond they cannot accidentally ruin. But the water tested clean. No industrial waste. No agricultural runoff. No secret chemical dumps. Just perfectly normal, slightly murky pond water, full of ordinary pond vibes. Next hypothesis: parasites, specifically the kind that burrow into amphibian skin and cause mild swelling. But mild swelling is not the same as my entire torso just detonated like a festive grenade. Parasites could not account for the dramatic ballooning, nor the violent rupture that followed. Then they tested for fungal infections. But again, while fungi could cause deformities, none were known to cause spontaneous amphibian combustion. Not even the weird fungi. Meanwhile, reports kept pouring in. More toads exploding, more ponds affected, more citizens whispering, "We do not remember this happening last spring." The mystery deepened. Some scientists suggested a viral outbreak. Others proposed a sudden genetic mutation. One postdoctoral researcher suggested that perhaps the toads had recently taken up meditation and were accidentally overachieving in the breath expansion portion of the practice. None of these theories held up. And then, finally, a pattern emerged. Only one species of toad was exploding. Only one area of Hamburg was affected. Only one predator seemed unusually active in that region. And that predator, as it turned out, held the key to everything. The scientists noticed that many of the dead toads were missing something. Not limbs, not skin, not their sense of dignity that was already gone. No, they were missing one very specific organ. Their livers. Each exploded toad had a tidy, precise incision. No tearing, no chewing, just a hole. A hole exactly the size a particular predator leaves when helping itself to a fresh, delicious amphibian liver. This was not an illness. This was not a disease. This was not paranormal toad behavior. This was a murder. A very tiny, very gruesome murder spree. And the culprit was none other than one of nature's most clever and unapologetic opportunists. Crows. Yes, crows. Black-feathered masterminds. Tiny feathered scientists. Criminals with wings. Hamburg's local crows had discovered that toads contained tasty, protein-rich livers. But because crows are both brilliant and slightly chaotic, they had developed a method for extracting the liver without messing up the rest of the toad. A surgical method. A precise method. A method that, as it turned out, had an unintended explosive side effect. Because the toad are now missing its liver, did what any shocked amphibian would do. It puffed up. Toads puff themselves up as a defense mechanism, trying to appear bigger to predators. But when you remove the liver, which happens to sit right next to the lungs, you create a perfect hollow cavity. So the toad inflates and inflates and inflates, and without its liver holding everything in place. Boom. Nature had accidentally created a biological pressure cooker with legs. This, the scientists realized, was the explanation. The exploding toads were not victims of environmental catastrophe. They were victims of brilliant, mildly sadistic crows who had discovered a shortcut to fine dining. The mystery was solved. But the story was not over. Because now the scientists had to explain this to the public. Imagine standing in front of cameras, trying to calmly say, "Good evening. The toads are exploding because the crows have learned surgery." It is not the sentence anyone dreams of delivering. But there was still one more twist. The part that would make the world shake its head in awe at nature's dark humor. Because these crows, they learned their technique by watching humans. And that is where we go next. The revelation that crows were delicately performing amphibian surgery sent a ripple of mild panic through the scientific community, not because anyone doubted the intelligence of crows. Everyone already knew they could use tools, solve puzzles, and remember the faces of people who annoyed them. But even the most crow-loving ornithologist did not expect to wake up one morning and learn that the local birds had quietly enrolled themselves in a gastrointestinal internship. But that was exactly what happened. Once scientists published their findings, other researchers began chiming in. They reported sightings of crows swooping down, flipping toads onto their backs with casual expertise, and extracting the liver with a level of precision usually reserved for medical professionals or highly motivated raccoons. The behavior was consistent. It was intentional. It was shockingly efficient. Crows had become toad liver connoisseurs. But the question remained, how on earth did they learn this? And this is the part of the story where the scientists had to sit down, rub their temples, and admit that the crows learned their technique from humans. Not directly. No scientist ever stood in front of a chalkboard teaching crows, "Now class, the liver is here." No one gave the birds tiny lab coats. No one hosted a feather-friendly medical seminar. The teaching was accidental, an unintended side effect of human curiosity. You see, long before the explosion mystery reached the public, researchers studying amphibians sometimes dissected toads in open outdoor areas. It was convenient, efficient, and allowed them to work near the habitats they were studying. They would make careful incisions. They would examine the organs. They would place the toads' bodies aside. And, crucially, the local crows, being crows, watched everything. Crows watch everything. They watch you unlock the trash bin. They watch you feed the ducks and judge you for it. They watch your dog do something embarrassing and store that information forever. They watched scientists dissect toads with meticulous attention, memorizing each motion like students studying for a very dark biology exam. To a crow, human activity is a tutorial, an instructional video. A step-by-step guide titled How to Get Free Food Using Opposable Thumb Techniques you do not have. The scientists at first struggled to accept this. Surely crows would not imitate such a complex action. Surely something else was influencing their behavior. Surely this was all a wild coincidence. But then the evidence poured in. A park ranger recalls seeing crows gather around field researchers years earlier, perched on branches like feathery students at a lecture. Another scientist reminisced that crows had stolen dissected samples from trays, inspecting them with thoughtful little head tilts that suggested a combination of disgust and intrigue. Then came the pattern analyses. The incisions on the exploded toads matched the incisions scientists made during dissections. Not exactly, but close enough to prove that the crows had watched, practiced, and perfected their technique. Think about that. The crows didn't just copy the action once. They refined it. They made it better. They even adjusted their strategy to minimize risk, flipping the toads onto their backs first to avoid toxic skin secretions. That detail alone made several biologists lie down on the ground and stare at the sky. contemplating the fact that their job had accidentally created a species of tiny, liver-seeking surgeons with wings. And naturally, since crow knowledge spreads socially, one clever crow became to crows, then four, then an entire murder of crows participating in what can only be described as a culinary trend. Toads, meanwhile, did not appreciate the innovation. Not even a little. A toad missing a liver is technically alive for a short while, but extremely confused, extremely vulnerable, and extremely puffed up, because its instinct is to inflate as a defense mechanism. Its lungs expand, its skin stretches, its insides shift, and without the liver to anchor things in place, well, you remember what happens. The scientists tried to keep straight faces while explaining this to reporters. But nothing prepares you for standing in front of microphones and announcing, "The toads are exploding due to advanced crow-assisted laparoscopic theft." Journalists blinked. Cameras flashed. Somewhere, a crow observed from a nearby tree, no doubt filing the press conference under important human behavior to remember. As the news spread, people began treating the crows with a mixture of fear, awe, and grudging respect. The birds, meanwhile, continued their daily routines as if nothing was unusual. To them, eating toad livers was no more dramatic than a human deciding to try a new restaurant. But the situation still wasn't fully understood, because scientists had a new question, a bigger question, lurking beneath the feathers and tragedy. Why did the toads explode in Hamburg, and only Hamburg? Plenty of crows lived in other places. Plenty of toads lived in other ponds. Humans had dissected toads outdoors in many countries. So why was Germany experiencing a seasonal amphibian fireworks show, while everyone else remained blissfully toad intact? The answer would turn out to be both ecological and beautifully absurd. And, once again, it wasn't just about the crows, or the humans, or the toads. It was about the environment. The whole ecosystem forming a perfect storm of conditions that turned one German pond into a living, croaking crime scene. And that is where we float next. Once scientists realized crows were responsible for the missing livers, and the explosions were a tragic side effect of toad physiology, the next puzzle slipped into place like a slimy, amphibian-shaped jigsaw piece. Why Hamburg? Why this pond this year? This species? This location? Crows live everywhere. Toads live everywhere. Humans dissect things everywhere, especially biologists, who are known to do science anywhere except the one place they can actually find a table. So, what made this pond the epicenter of the Great Toad Detonation event? To solve this, the researchers zoomed out. They stopped thinking about individual toads. They stopped thinking about crows. They stepped back, figuratively, then literally, because they realized they were standing in toad debris, and looked at the ecosystem as a whole. And when they did, the answer came into focus. Hamburg's ponds had become unusually crowded. Toad populations had surged for reasons no one immediately understood. Possibly warmer spring temperatures, possibly a good breeding season, possibly because amphibians, like humans, sometimes make questionable collective decisions. Whatever the cause, the ponds were brimming with toads. It was a toad metropolis, a toad traffic jam, a toad New York City, but with more croaking and fewer overpriced apartments. Now add to this bustling amphibian suburb another ecological detail. Hamburg had, at the same time, seen a spike in crow populations. Why? Because the city, in its earnest effort to reduce garbage on the streets, had installed new trash containers that prevented gulls from stealing food, but conveniently provided an all-you-can-eat buffet for crows clever enough to figure out the latches. Spoiler, the crows figured out the latches. So the crow population boomed, and boomed, and boomed. Now, ecological rule number 1. If you increase the number of hungry, curious birds in an area, eventually they will start experimenting with the menu. And in these ponds, overflowing with plump, slow-moving amphibians, toads became the undisputed dish of the season. But it wasn't just any toad. It was the common European toad, a species that, for reasons best described as unfortunate evolutionary design, has a particularly large, particularly tasty liver compared to its body size. Crows noticed. In a world of bird gastronomy, toad liver is like foie gras. If foie gras could inflate and explode. So the crows adapted. And then came the second ecological twist, the one that made everything worse. These toads had evolved a powerful defensive behavior, inflating rapidly when threatened. This usually deterred predators. But when a crow removed their liver, that instinct turned catastrophic. Take away the liver, remove the stabilizing structure, trigger the inflation reflex, and suddenly you have amphibian grenades. The scientists realized Hamburg had created a perfect storm. High crow population, high toad population, a particularly vulnerable toad species, an accidental education in surgery, a pond shallow enough for crows to wade in casually like tiny surgeons doing house calls. It was a domino effect, nature's own Rube Goldberg machine, the kind of wildly improbable chain reaction that only works when every piece is in exactly the right or wrong place. But the researchers were not done uncovering absurdities, because as they interviewed local residents, a curious detail surfaced. The crows were not eating any other part of the toad, just the liver. Not the legs, not the skin, not the meat. Nothing else. Just the liver. This was unusual, even for crows, who are not known to be picky. A crow will eat garbage, French fries, dead things, live things, shiny things, and occasionally someone's unattended sandwich. But here they were, eating only the liver, as if the birds had suddenly become dietary purists. Why? Because the toads of Hamburg secrete toxins. Normally, crows would avoid such prey. But these crows, clever, emotionally detached, possibly harboring culinary ambitions, figured out that the liver itself was toxin-free. The poison glands were near the skin, not the organs. They knew exactly what to avoid. This meant that the crows of Hamburg had unintentionally observed human dissection sedentide, the tastiest organ, learned how to extract it efficiently, avoided the toxic parts, created a chain reaction that turned ponds Into amphibian minefields, scientists stared at their notes in silence, realizing they had uncovered not just a bizarre ecological event, but a case study in crow intelligence, so advanced it bordered on uncomfortable. It was around this time that one biologist said, perhaps too softly, "We may be in trouble if they ever unionize." And yet, even with all this knowledge, one question still floated unanswered above the algae-covered waters. Why did the crows only begin the liver extraction behavior that year? The answer required one final twist. One last ecological coincidence so absurd that it felt almost like a cosmic joke. Because earlier that season, local cats had begun hunting toads too. Not for food, but for entertainment. Their attacks left injured toads hopping awkwardly and unpredictably round the shoreline. And crows, ever observant, watched the pattern. Cat attacks equals easy organ access. Easy organ access equals tasty liver snacks. Tasty liver snacks equals evolutionary skill. Unlocked. The crows learned the cat's trick, then improved it, then perfected it, then industrialized it. Nature, in its infinite complexity, had taught the crows a recipe. Humans had taught them the technique, and the toads provided the ingredients. It was tragic. It was fascinating. It was deeply, deeply absurd, and it explained everything. But the story wasn't over, because the aftermath, the public reaction, and the scientific consequences would become just as surreal as the exploding toads themselves. When the full explanation emerged, crows performing unsolicited toad surgery, cats inventing the training module, and amphibians responding with the biological equivalent of a fireworks show, the public reaction was immediate, dramatic, and deeply entertaining. The German media, with admirable speed and no hesitation whatsoever, named the crisis der Krötenexplosion, the toad explosion, which is frankly a title that goes unnecessarily hard for a story about confused amphibians and birds doing wet, feathery crime. Newspapers printed headlines like, "The mystery of the frog bombs, evil crows strike again, toads popping like balloons." Scientists confused and covered in toad, and once the international press got involved, things escalated. British tabloids declared the pond a cursed bog. American outlets suggested toxins, aliens, and possibly government experiments, because Americans will always pick the most dramatic option available. One Japanese paper simply wrote, "Hamburg. Dozens of toads explode. Scientists troubled." Which is the correct amount of emotional distance. The scientists themselves were suddenly thrust into the spotlight, which, if you've ever met a field biologist, you know is not where they prefer to be. Their ideal environment is somewhere quiet, slightly muddy, with a vague smell of pond water and no microphones. But now they were on TV. A zoology professor found himself explaining to a roomful of reporters, "No, the toads are not spontaneously combusting. No, it's not a new amphibian disease. No, you will not explode if you touch the pond water." A journalist raised her hand. "Are the crows targeting humans' necks?" The professor blinked. "No. Crows do not remove liver organs from humans. He paused. Usually, the next day. Several newspapers printed, "Crow liver thieves could come for humans," expert says, which was not ideal. Meanwhile, pet owners in Hamburg began looking nervously at their cats, who stared back with the innocent, slightly evil expression cats have mastered. Cats, for the record, did not care about the exploding toads. Cats rarely care about anything except food bowls and the emotional suffering of their owners. The public wanted answers. They wanted solutions. They wanted reassurance that nature was not secretly plotting against them. In the shape of a black-feathered surgical strike team. So scientists drafted official explanations, which included sentences like, "The toads explode due to excessive internal pressure following liver extraction by crows." This did not comfort anyone. School children became obsessed. Teachers begged for better phrasing. One child asked, "Does the toad know it is going to explode?" And the teacher had to step into the hallway for a moment to breathe. But while the public panicked cheerfully, conservationists had a more serious concern. The toads were dying. Fast, populationally speaking, it was a problem. When an animal explodes, it does not produce offspring. This is one of the few biological facts everyone can agree upon. So the environmental agencies of Hamburg convened emergency meetings. Should they scare off the crows? Should they relocate the toads? Should they put little safety helmets on the toads? Should they put warning signs around the pond that read, "Caution, amphibian detonation zone"? All were debated. None were adopted. Except for one. Researchers gently relocated breeding toads to deeper, safer ponds with fewer crows, which is essentially the wildlife management equivalent of moving someone to a nicer neighborhood. With less crime. Meanwhile, German citizens started visiting the pond out of morbid curiosity, which only made things worse. The city had to put up fences, signs, barriers, a security guard whose job was to tell people, "Please do not disturb the exploding amphibians." It did not help. That around this time, a local comedian released a parody song called Boom Boom Toad, which briefly charted. Nothing says ecological crisis quite like an upbeat pop track about amphibians detonating. But amidst all the chaos, something interesting happened. The more people learned about the cause, the crows watching humans, analyzing toads selectively, removing organs with precision, the more people grew fascinated rather than frightened. Articles shifted tone from horror to awe. Scientists received interviews not about the danger, but about the intelligence. The public began to appreciate how shockingly clever crows really are. Suddenly, the story was no longer about exploding amphibians. It was about the brilliance of birds. One newspaper headline even read, "Crows prove they are smarter than humans by inventing new food technique," and honestly, it wasn't wrong. Researchers were asked to appear on talk shows to discuss crow cognition. Documentaries filmed, segments about problem-solving birds. Crows, blissfully unaware of their rising celebrity status, continued living their chaotic lives without issuing a public statement. But the scientists still had one final story to tell, the part where the entire event looped back to ecology, biology, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes nature just stacks its dominoes in the weirdest possible way. The final chapter wasn't explosive. It was reflective, gentle, soft around the edges. Because after the feathers settled and the amphibian confetti was washed away, the world realized something unexpectedly profound. The exploding toad crisis wasn't caused by malice. It wasn't caused by disease. It wasn't caused by toxins. It was caused by intelligence, opportunity, adaptation, and a very unfortunate design flaw involving toad organs and internal pressure. It was nature doing what nature does, experimenting, adjusting, learning, and sometimes accidentally creating amphibian fireworks. But the story wasn't done yet. There was still the aftermath, the long-term consequences, the legacy, the scientific ripple effects. And those would be just as strange. In the months that followed the Great Toad Explosion crisis, the scientific world found itself adjusting to the new reality. That crows, already famous for using tools, recognizing human faces, and committing petty crimes against fast food, customers had now unofficially added amphibian surgery to their resumes. This forced researchers to confront a slightly uncomfortable possibility. If crows could learn this, what else were they learning? Scientists have long suspected that crows were watching us, observing, cataloging, evaluating. But this was the first time nature had responded in such a dramatic and, depending on your tolerance for amphibian debris, cinematic way. The Hamburg incident prompted researchers around the world to take a closer look at crow behavior, and what they found was astonishing. In Japan, crows were placing nuts on busy roads so cars would crack them open. In the US, crows were crafting hooks out of twigs to extract insects. In Europe, crows were memorizing bus schedules so they could ride in, forage, then hop off at their stop like tiny, very judgmental commuters. But the toad liver incident stood above them all because it involved a multi-step process, anatomical understanding, and the adaptation of a strategy learned through observation of an entirely different species. It wasn't just clever, it was cross-species innovation. And so, researchers began studying crow intelligence with new urgency. Funding proposals described crows as a cognitively advanced species, with the potential for complex cultural transmission, which is academic. Code for these birds are getting too smart, and we need to keep an eye on them before they start negotiating treaties. Meanwhile, the ponds of Hamburg slowly returned to normal as conservationists relocated breeding pairs and restored habitat areas. The toad population stabilized. The seasonal mating rituals resumed, hundreds of amphibians croaking softly at twilight, unaware of the explosive events of months prior. The crows, too, adjusted their diets. With more natural food sources available, their interest in risky amphibian cuisine faded. Nature, in its quiet way, healed. But the incident left its mark. Researchers published papers with titles like Cross-Species Observational Learning in Corvids, Ecology, Predation, and Spontaneous Amphibian Combustion, and a case study in unintended consequences. Of human field research scientists chuckled softly while giving conference presentations. That began with lines like, "Now, bear with me. This next slide contains several exploded amphibians." The world moved on, but the story stuck. Partly because it was grotesque, partly because it was hilarious, partly because it was haunting, but mostly because it was human. We study animals. Animals study us. Sometimes they imitate what we do. Sometimes they misunderstand what we do. And sometimes, oh sometimes, they watch us perform a dissection, think, "Oh, that's neat," and proceed to recreate the procedure on the nearest unsuspecting toad. This is the quiet romance of ecology, species influencing each other in ways no one predicts, forming accidental partnerships and catastrophic misunderstandings. The exploding toads became a symbol, not of horror, but of the delicate interconnectedness of nature and science. They reminded researchers that every action, no matter how small, can ripple through an ecosystem in ways both tragic and comedic. But while the scientific community reflected deeply, the internet, which was still in its early memetic adolescence, did something else. It made jokes. Forums filled with comments like, "Achievement unlocked," "Nature's pipe bomb," "Crows out here doing illegal surgeries without a license." Imagine being a toad and your death makes international news. Someone lovingly crafted an animation of a crow wearing a lab coat and glasses, lecturing fledgling crows on how to remove the forbidden snack. A t-shirt appeared online featuring the phrase, "Crows did not mean to cause this." Nature documentaries, usually very serious and narrated by people with voices like warm velvet, briefly included earnest descriptions of crow-induced spontaneous amphibian rupture, said in the calmest tone imaginable. But beyond the chaos of memes and headlines, something more lasting happened. Teachers began using the exploding toad story as a case study in ecology, animal behavior, and the scientific method. Students learned how researchers build hypotheses, how ecosystems interact in unexpected ways, how a single human action, even something routine, can teach another species something unintended. It became a living lesson in natural complexity, and it changed the way many people viewed crows. Instead of seeing them as spooky background birds, people began to appreciate them as intelligent, curious, socially sophisticated creatures capable of astonishing feats. Some even began feeding them. Others left puzzles for them. A few even developed crow friendships, which often ended with the birds bringing shiny gifts, coins, keys, scraps of foil, or in one case, a chicken nugget. Crows were thriving not because of the toads, but because humans finally understood. Then better, and somewhere, in a German pond, the toads continued living their damp, peaceful lives, blissfully unaware of the scientific revolution their misfortune had triggered. But there was still one final chapter to tell, about how the story ended, how the world processed it, and what it taught us about the strange, unpredictable dance between intelligence and instinct. Because the tale of the exploding toads wasn't just about ecological missteps. It was about curiosity. It was about adaptation. It was about the weird, wonderful ways life unfolds when nobody is paying quite enough attention. As the scientific dust settled, and the amphibian dust, which required a separate cleanup, the exploding toad saga transformed from a sensational headline into something quieter, something richer, something almost philosophical. The scientists gathered their data, cleaned their boots, and stared at the pond with expressions that wavered between relief and existential dread. The public calmed down. The newspapers moved on. The men's faded into internet obscurity, but the story lingered, because it was more than just a bizarre ecological event. It was a window into the nature of intelligence, the fragility of ecosystems, and the unintended consequences of being observed by animals with better pattern recognition skills than we'd like to admit. First came the reflection on intelligence. For decades, scientists had suspected crows possessed remarkable cognitive abilities. They used tools. They planned ahead. They remembered slights. They solved puzzles faster than some humans solve their taxes. But the toad incident cemented something deeper. Crows weren't just clever. They were observational learners, capable of transferring knowledge across species lines. A rare, sophisticated trait. It meant that when humans dissected toads, the crows weren't just watching. They were studying, evaluating, taking notes in their little crow brains with a level of focus many students do not achieve during lectures. This realization left researchers uneasy, whispering things like, perhaps we should not perform dissections outdoors anymore. And what if they start teaching the pigeons? But it also filled them with awe, because intelligence in other species often reveals what intelligence truly is. Not human, not linear, not predictable, but a vast, creative force that emerges wherever life demands it. Next came the reflection on ecosystems. The toad explosions were not the result of one factor, but many. The climate that boosted toad breeding, the trash systems that boosted crow populations, the cats that provided behavioral templates, the humans performing dissections. Outdoors, the toad physiology that produced the dramatic finale. It was a perfect storm, a chain of small things that lined up disastrously. This became a powerful teaching tool. A reminder that ecosystems are not delicate because they are weak. They are delicate because they are interconnected, each piece tugging gently at every other piece. When you pull one thread, the fabric moves in ways you cannot always predict. And sometimes that fabric explodes amphibians. But beneath the comedy and curiosity, there was something surprisingly tender born from the incident. A newfound empathy for creatures people often overlook. Toads, once seen as simple, slimy afterthoughts of nature, suddenly received a wave of sympathy. They became the tragic heroes of a story they did not understand and certainly did not sign up for. Schools taught about them. Conservationists protected their breeding grounds. Children drew pictures of toads with capes and wrote essays titled, "Why We Should Protect Amphibians and Also They Should Not Pop." And the crows, far from being villainized, gained admiration, not as malicious creatures, but as brilliant survivors. The story showcased their ingenuity, their boldness, their humor, and their remarkable ability to adapt to environments shaped by humans. People began noticing crows more often, noticing their calls, their gatherings, their curious tilts of the head. their tendency to drop things just to see what happens. The story made people look up. Nature felt closer, sharper, more alive, as if the world had been quietly whispering, "Look at me," and for once, humans actually did. And finally, there was the reflection on the scientific journey itself. The exploding toads forced researchers to abandon assumptions and follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it led to a crime scene involving small amphibians and a gang of feathered geniuses. It reminded the world that science isn't just a neat procession of facts. It's messy, unexpected, sometimes tragic, often hilarious, and always full of mysteries waiting to be solved by people willing to stand in a swamp and say, "Okay, what on earth is happening here?" Through all this, the pond in Hamburg remained quiet, unaware of its strange fame. The toads croaked softly. The crows flew overhead, their wings slicing through the air with self-assured grace. The sun dipped behind trees. The water shimmered. If you didn't know the story, you'd never guess that this tranquil place once turned into an amphibian battlefield. Orchestrated by birds who watched one too many outdoor dissections. Life went on, as it always does. But the final chapter still awaited. The last step of the tale, the legacy, the gentle lesson hidden beneath the hilarity. Because the story of the exploding toads isn't just about toads or crows or scientists or ecosystems. It's about the wild, unpredictable poetry of nature. A poetry that occasionally writes a stanza so bizarre that humanity collectively blinks and says, "Really? This is what we're doing now?" And that is where our finale takes us next. In the end, the story of the exploding toads settled into the quiet corner of history reserved for events that are both ridiculous and profound. The kind of stories that begin with laughter and end with a long, thoughtful stare into a pond. 4 months after the crisis faded, scientists returned periodically to Hamburg, checking on the toads, measuring water quality, watching for disturbances, and scanning the skies for suspicious crows who might be sharpening scalpels behind the trees. Everything had returned to normal. The toads croaked, the crows cawed, the pond rippled, and nothing exploded. Nature had reset, but the legacy remained. Researchers published their findings. Documentaries aired. Teachers used the story as a warning against underestimating animals with feathers and ambition. Biology classrooms buzzed with students saying things like, "Wait, so the crows caused the explosions? And why does nature do this to us?" It became a strange, comforting sort of legend. Proof that the natural world has a sense of humor, a sense of chaos, and a sense of timing so impeccable it borders on theatrical. Because, really, what are the odds? A human dissects a toad, a crow watches, a crow imitates, a cat provides an optional tutorial, a toad inflates, and the entire ecosystem briefly transforms into amphibian pyrotechnics. It is absurd, it is tragic, it is fascinating, and it is wonderfully, undeniably real. But beneath the chaos lies a gentle truth. Humans are not separate from nature. We are tangled in it. Every action, Every study, every experiment, every leftover lunch we leave on a park bench echoes through the lives of the creatures around us. Sometimes that echo is harmless. Sometimes it is beautiful. And sometimes it teaches crows how to remove amphibian organs with surgical precision. Nature is always watching, always learning, always responding. And so, the exploding toads became an unexpected reminder of ecological humility. That we, the species who like to think of ourselves as the planet's main characters, are constantly influencing other species in ways we cannot predict. Sometimes we shape them, sometimes they shape us, and sometimes they observe us so closely that they create an entirely new hunting technique that forces scientists to hold emergency press conferences. The story also became a love letter to scientific curiosity, the kind that refuses to look away, even when what you are looking at is a pond full of amphibian mysteries and unscheduled explosions. Because science isn't just a collection of facts, it's a way of paying attention, a willingness to investigate the world even when the answers are inconvenient, messy, or embarrassing enough to require drafting a sentence like, "The crows have demonstrated impressive organ removal skills." And, most of all, the story became a testament to the resilience of life. The toads recovered, the crows moved on, the pond found its balance, and the world added another wonderfully strange chapter to its endless storybook. So, as you drift towards sleep, eyes heavy, mind soft, imagine the Hamburg pond on a calm spring evening. The sky is lavender, the air smells faintly of moss, a breeze ripples the water. The toads croak in the reeds, gentle and rhythmic, unaware of the scientific frenzy they once sparked. Crows perch silently on nearby branches, their black silhouettes peaceful. No surgical intentions in sight. Everything is quiet. Everything is still. Everything is whole. It is a reminder that nature, even in its strangest moments, always returns to calm. And that sometimes the most bizarre stories in science are also the most comforting, because they show us a world that is alive, adaptive, unpredictable, funny, resilient, and endlessly surprising. A world where intelligence takes many forms. A world where ecosystems dance together in unexpected ways. A world where even exploding toads have something to teach us. And so the tale ends, softly, in a whisper across the pond. Nature is strange. Nature is brilliant. Nature is watching. Nature is learning. And nature, even at its most explosive, is always worth paying attention to.